The fire burned low, spitting embers like whispered warnings into the dimly lit room. Shadows twisted against the walls, stretching and shrinking with each flicker of light. It should have been an ordinary night, calm, predictable. But then Michael spoke, and in an instant, the air changed. Write in the comments where you're listening to us from. You won't believe what happened when I crossed that line in the relationship. It's a turnaround I certainly didn't expect. Michael sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable. I curled up in my usual corner of the sofa, a warm mug of tea cradled in my hands, the steam curling into the air like a ghost of something forgotten. I should have seen it coming. There had been signs. Little things. The way he hesitated before kissing me lately. The distant glances over dinner. The way his hands rested idly on his lap, when once they had always found mine. But nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. What would you think about spending time with someone else? His voice was measured, too calm, like he had rehearsed it 100 times before finally letting it escape. At first I thought he was joking. I even let out a soft laugh, half expecting him to chuckle and say, "Just messing with you, babe." But he didn't. Spending time? I repeated, my throat suddenly dry. Like with friends? Michael put his phone down. Slowly, deliberately. Then he met my eyes, and the look in them sent ice-cold shivers down my spine. "No," he said. "I mean with another man. Just one night. No strings attached." My breath caught in my chest. The silence between us thickened, pressing against my ribs, making it impossible to move. My Michael, the same man who had once glared at a bartender for calling me darling, the man who scoffed at open relationships like they were something reserved for people who didn't know real love, was saying this? "You're serious?" I choked out. My voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else. He nodded, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Look, I've been reading about couples who do this, who bring someone else into their relationship. It could help us." Help us. The words echoed in my head like a cruel joke. The way he said it, carefully, cautiously, only made it worse, like he was tiptoeing through a minefield he had willingly set up himself. "Help us." I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "What is this really about, Michael? Are you bored? Am I not enough anymore?" His jaw clenched, and he ran a hand through his hair, a tell I had come to recognize over the years. He did it when he was nervous, when he didn't know how to explain himself. "It's not that," he said. "Sarah, it's not about you not being enough. It's about us, our marriage. Things have felt routine. Stale. Routine. Stale." Two words that hit harder than they should have. Because deep down, a part of me feared he was right. I had felt it too. The slow unraveling. The way passion had cooled into something manageable. Predictable. But wasn't that just part of marriage? Everyone went through phases, right? And phases weren't a reason to. My stomach twisted. "And who?" I asked slowly, the venom in my voice undeniable. "Do you think would be perfect for this little experiment?" Michael hesitated. "Not for long enough." "James." The world tilted. James. Our gym trainer. The one Michael had practically shoved me toward when he insisted we should work out together. Tall, confident, with that frustrating, effortless charisma. The kind of man who probably never second-guessed himself a day in his life. And now I realized, Michael hadn't just been encouraging me to exercise. He had been laying the groundwork. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered. Michael held up his hands in defense, his expression frustratingly calm. "I haven't planned anything. I just thought about it." "Thought about it?" I repeated, standing so fast my tea nearly spilled. "You've actually considered this?" "You want me to?" My voice cracked. He exhaled, slow and measured. "I wouldn't bring it up if I didn't think it could bring us closer." Closer. The word clung to the air between us, bitter and mocking. "You've completely lost your mind," I whispered, shaking my head. Instead of fighting back, Michael just sat there, his expression unreadable. And somehow, that unnerved me more than if he had yelled, if he had fought to convince me. "Just think about it," he said, voice quiet. "That's all I'm asking." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head. Michael was asleep beside me, his breaths deep and even, like he hadn't just upended my entire world hours before. Meanwhile, my mind refused to be still, because, despite everything, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice whispering inside me. The one that asked, what if he's right? The same voice that wondered, feared, what had happened to the passionate, unpredictable love we once had. Was this really where we were now? And then, as if my thoughts had conjured him, James appeared. Not in a dream. Not in some distant, hypothetical future. But in the form of a single message on my phone. A message that would change everything. Saturday arrived like an inevitable storm cloud. Heavy. Looming. Impossible to ignore. I had spent the last 2 days avoiding Michael, floating through the house like a ghost of myself, barely speaking. Every time he tried to bring it up, I cut him off, pretending I was too busy, too tired, too anything to have that conversation again. And yet, despite my silence, the decision was taken out of my hands. That morning, as I stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring my coffee, Michael casually dropped a bombshell. "James is coming over for dinner tonight." I nearly dropped my mug. "What?" My voice came out too sharp, too unsteady. Michael, on the other hand, was perfectly calm. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, looking at me like he was just announcing the weather. He mentioned at the gym that he hasn't had a proper home-cooked meal in a while. I thought it'd be nice to have him over.
Nice.
I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. "No pressure, of course," Michael added, almost as an afterthought. "No pressure." The words hung between us like an unspoken dare. I wanted to say no, to refuse, to throw my coffee at the wall and demand to know what the hell he was playing at. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, I hesitated, and Michael saw it. His lips twitched just slightly, but enough for me to know that, in some twisted way, he thought he was winning. That was how I found myself standing in front of the mirror later that evening, second-guessing everything. Was my dress too much? Was my makeup too subtle? Why did I care? I hated the way my stomach twisted with something dangerously close to anticipation. Hated the way I was hyper-aware of my own reflection, of the way my neckline dipped just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be obvious. I hated even more the tiny, insidious thought that crept into my mind. What if this was the spark Michael was looking for?
The doorbell rang.
Michael answered it before I could even move, his voice warm, inviting. "Come on in, man." And then, James stepped inside. Just as I remembered him.
Tall.
Confident. That easy, relaxed grin. But when his eyes met mine, something in them flickered. Just for a second. A brief, almost imperceptible pause. A pause I pretended not to notice. "Sarah," James said smoothly, stepping forward, holding my gaze just a second too long. "Good to finally spend some time outside the gym." I forced a polite smile. "Of course. Make yourself at home." The dinner started off normal enough. Michael was in full host mode, pouring wine, cracking jokes, keeping the conversation flowing like nothing was unusual. But I could feel it. The weight of James's attention. The way his eyes lingered when I wasn't looking. The way he leaned in just slightly whenever I spoke, like he wanted to hear every word. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't anything Michael could point to and say, "See?" But it was there. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. At one point, James raised his glass. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and smooth, "this meal is incredible. You really outdid yourself." Michael leaned back in his chair, his grin just a little too smug. "See, Sarah? I told you James would appreciate it." I glanced at Michael, trying to read his expression. Was this amusement? Was it satisfaction? Was he actually enjoying this? James, on the other hand, didn't seem the least bit fazed. If anything, he looked entertained, as if he was in on something I wasn't. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just Michael's game. James was playing too. And I was the prize. The night stretched on, wine glasses emptied and refilled, the atmosphere growing thicker with something unspoken. Michael eventually excused himself to grab another bottle, leaving me and James alone for the first time. Silence settled between us, heavy and charged. "You're quiet tonight," James murmured. I forced a small laugh. "Just a lot on my mind." James tilted his head slightly, studying me. "Well," he said, his voice softer now, "whatever it is, I'm sure you'll figure it out. You seem like the kind of woman who knows what she wants." The way he said it,
Low.
deliberate, it sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but then Michael returned, bottle in hand, his presence both a relief and a fresh wave of anxiety. Did he notice? Did he want me to notice? The night ended with polite goodbyes, promises to do it again soon. But as I stood in the doorway, watching James disappear into the night, I couldn't shake the weight of his words, or the way his gaze lingered. Michael closed the door behind him and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, "that wasn't so bad, was it?" I stared at him, unsure how to answer, because the truth was, I didn't know anymore. And that, more than anything, terrified me. The texts started the next day. At first, they were harmless, casual. A simple, "had a great time last night. Thanks for dinner." I hesitated before replying. I should have ignored it, let it sit unanswered. But instead, my fingers moved on their own. "Glad you enjoyed it." A few hours later, another text. "Michael's lucky. Not many people can cook like that." It felt like a compliment, but it wasn't just about the food. I knew that. I typed out thanks and left it at that. But it didn't stop. Over the next few days, James kept finding excuses to message me. A joke about something Michael said. A question about a recipe. An update from the gym. Always something small. Nothing inappropriate. But the tension was there.
Growing.
Michael noticed. "You seem distracted," he said over dinner, eyes flicking toward my phone. I forced a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, but didn't look convinced. That night, I stared at my phone, watching the screen light up with another message from James. I didn't open it, but I didn't delete it either. It escalated the following weekend. Michael was working late, and I was home alone when my phone buzzed.
James.
"What are you up to?" I hesitated, then replied. "Just relaxing." "You?" A pause. "Thinking about you." My breath caught. I should have shut it down. Should have ignored it. Instead, I typed, "James." Before I could send it, another message appeared. "Can I see you?" I stared at the screen, heart pounding. And then, without thinking, I typed, "Come over." The knock at the door came 20 minutes later. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob. One last chance to stop this. To turn back. I opened the door. James stood there, casual but purposeful, his eyes locking onto mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. No, I wasn't. But I stepped aside anyway. He walked in, and suddenly the space between us felt too small, too charged. I moved toward the kitchen, needing distance. "Do you want something to drink?" "I didn't come here for that," he said. I turned, and he was closer now. Too close. "This is a mistake," I whispered. His gaze didn't waver. "Then tell me to leave." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. His fingers brushed my wrist, light but deliberate. "Sarah." My resolve crumbled. I let him kiss me, and I kissed him back. The moment his lips touched mine, the world blurred. It wasn't soft. It wasn't hesitant. It was a collision, heat, urgency, everything I had ignored, denied, now pouring out all at once. His hand slid down my waist, pulling me closer. I should have stopped him. Should have stepped back. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers tangle in his shirt, gripping him like he was the only thing keeping me standing. James exhaled sharply. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my lips. I didn't. I couldn't. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice screamed at me, "Michael, my marriage, the life I was about to shatter." But when James lifted me onto the kitchen counter, his hands strong, his breath warm against my skin, that voice disappeared. For the first time in years, I felt awake. And I let it happen. The second it was over, reality crashed down. I sat on the kitchen counter, my breath uneven, my heart slamming against my ribs. The heat of James's touch still lingered on my skin, but the moment was already unraveling. James stepped back first, running a hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He looked at me, really looked at me, like he was waiting for something. Regret? Guilt? A goodbye? I couldn't give him any of those. I slid off the counter, straightening my dress, my fingers shaking as I reached for a glass of water. My throat was dry, my mind even drier. What had I done? James didn't speak, but he didn't move either. He just stood there, watching me with that unreadable expression. "You okay?" he finally asked, his voice softer now, less sure. I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Okay? Was that even possible? "I don't know," I admitted. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, before I could even process what was happening, James reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I flinched. Not because I didn't want him to touch me again, because I did, but because I couldn't afford to let him. "This doesn't change anything," I whispered. The words tasted like a lie. James exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly, studying me. "Doesn't it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because we both knew the truth. Everything had changed. A car pulled into the driveway. Michael was home. And I was still standing in the kitchen, lips swollen, skin burning with the evidence of what I had just done. I had less than a minute to erase every trace. But nothing could erase what had just happened. The sound of Michael's car door slamming shut sent a jolt through me. James and I locked eyes for a split second. No words. Just raw, electric panic. "Go," I whispered, barely moving my lips. He didn't hesitate. James slipped out the back door just as Michael's key turned in the front lock. I rushed to the sink, flipping on the faucet, splashing cold water on my face, my hand still trembling. The door creaked open. "Sarah?" I swallowed hard, gripping the counter to steady myself before turning around. "Hey," I said, forcing my voice into something normal. Casual. Michael stood in the doorway, his tie loose, his sleeves rolled up, exhaustion etched into his features. He looked at me, really looked, and for a terrifying moment I thought he knew. Then he smiled. "Smells good in here," he said, setting his keys on the table. "You cooking something?" I forced a laugh.
Yeah.
Just trying a new recipe." The lie felt like acid in my throat. Michael kissed my cheek absent-mindedly before heading toward the fridge. My skin burned where James's hands had been minutes before. I needed to get out of there. "Didn't expect you home so early," I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Yeah, meeting got cut short." He pulled out a beer, cracking it open. "Figured I'd surprise you." I smiled, too wide, too forced.
Mise surprise.
Michael leaned against the counter, taking a sip. "You okay? You seem off." I froze, then forced a shrug. "Just tired." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a second too long. I turned away, pretending to check my phone. James had already texted. That was close. I exhaled shakily, deleting the message before I could even think about responding. Michael was still watching me. "You sure everything's okay?" I met his gaze, my stomach twisting.
Yeah, Elite.
And just like that, I became someone else. Lying to Michael was supposed to feel wrong. So, why did it feel so easy? And why, deep down, was I already waiting for the next message from James? Lying had become second nature. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee across from Michael, I felt nothing. No guilt, no hesitation, just the quiet hum of my phone vibrating on the counter. I flipped it over instinctively, heat rushing to my face, but Michael barely glanced up. I had expected the guilt to weigh on me, to make every glance from him feel like an interrogation. Instead, it was startlingly easy. The routine of our life continued uninterrupted. He scrolled through his phone, made casual conversation about work, kissed my cheek as he headed out the door. And I stood there, pretending I was still the woman he thought I was. James hadn't said much since that night, but the silence between us buzzed with something unspoken. He didn't need to spell it out, I already knew.
Knew he was thinking about it.
Knew he was remembering the way I had unraveled beneath his touch. Because I was remembering too. The messages started slow, harmless on the surface. A brief comment, a passing thought. But there was a weight behind every word, a charge that made my breath catch when I saw his name light up my screen. I told myself it was over, that it was a one-time lapse, a mistake that wouldn't happen again. But then the pull started. The way my eyes sought him out in places they shouldn't. The way my thoughts lingered too long on the feeling of his hands on my skin. The secrecy became its own addiction. A game where every glance, every unsent message, felt like a dare. I started waiting for it, the next text, the next excuse to cross paths. And then Michael looked at me differently. Not suspicious, not angry, just observant. Like he was seeing me for the first time in weeks. You've seemed different lately. I stood there, my hands frozen over a pile of laundry, forcing myself to breathe. He didn't know. Not yet. But something had shifted. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. I thought I had control. I thought I could manage the guilt, the lies, the way my body betrayed me every time I saw his name flash across my phone. I told myself I could stop before it spiraled, before it became something irreversible. I was wrong. The unraveling came in small moments. Michael watching me a second too long. My hands shaking when I picked up my phone. The way I lingered in places I knew James might be, waiting for an excuse I wouldn't admit I wanted. One night, it all cracked open. Michael had been quiet during dinner, his usual easy conversation replaced by something unreadable. I ignored it, focusing on the plate in front of me, willing my heartbeat to slow. But then he set down his fork and looked at me, really looked at me, in a way he hadn't in a long time. You've seemed different lately. My stomach clenched. I forced a smile, casual, careless. Work's been stressful. Just tired. A slow nod. That's all. His tone was light, but the weight of the words pressed against my chest. I swallowed, keeping my hands steady as I picked up my glass. Yeah, that's all. But he didn't look away. That night, as Michael lay beside me, breathing evenly in sleep, I stared at the ceiling, pulse thrumming in my ears. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining things. Then my phone buzzed.
James.
Meet me. My breath hitched. I turned my head, heart pounding, but Michael didn't stir. I shouldn't have answered. I should have ignored it, let it die in the silence. Instead, I slipped out of bed, my bare feet barely making a sound against the floor as I grabbed my keys. It was past midnight by the time I reached the parking lot behind the gym. The air was thick, humid, pressing against my skin like a warning. James was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed, the glow of a street lamp casting sharp angles over his face. I hesitated. One more step, and there would be no turning back. James pushed off the car, closing the space between us in slow, deliberate steps. You shouldn't have come, he murmured. You shouldn't have asked. A smirk, dark and knowing. But you did. I hated how easily he saw through me, how effortlessly he unraveled every weak excuse I had built to convince myself this wasn't inevitable. The moment he reached for me, I let him. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me flush against him, the heat of his body setting fire to every nerve in my skin. I felt the restraint in his touch, the quiet battle between control and need. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my ear. I didn't. Instead, I gripped the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer. It was reckless.
It was a mistake.
And I was drowning in it.
I didn't go home right away.
After James drove off, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, the scent of him still clinging to my skin. The weight of what I had just done settled over me like a stone. Then a text. Not from James. From Michael. "Where are you?" My throat tightened. My fingers hovered over the screen. I could lie. I could tell the truth. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Michael was awake, waiting, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could lie to him anymore. But the truth could destroy everything. I stared at the screen, heart hammering in my chest. Michael's message was short, direct. "Where are you?" No follow-ups, no accusations, just a question that carried the weight of everything I had been trying to ignore. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I typed. Couldn't sleep. Went for a drive. A half-truth. A desperate attempt to buy myself time. The 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel like it could anchor me. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every red light, every slow turn, stretched out the anticipation like a blade against my throat. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were damp against the leather. Michael was waiting. The living room lights were still on, the soft glow spilling out onto the porch. He stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, jaw set, his expression impossible to read. I stepped inside, shutting the door carefully behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt final. "You went for a drive," Michael said, his voice even. Controlled. I nodded.
Yeah.
Just needed some air. A long pause. His eyes never left mine. Alone. The word hung between us, sharp and unforgiving. I had lied to him before. Small things. Forgettable things. But this was different. I could feel the truth clawing at my throat, demanding to be spoken. But the truth would end us. So I forced myself to hold his gaze, to keep my voice steady. Yes. Michael studied me for a second too long, like he was deciding whether or not to believe me. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the calculations, the quiet battle between suspicion and trust. Then he exhaled, nodding slowly. "Okay," he said, stepping back. "Come to bed." That was it.
No accusations. No anger.
Just an invitation to return to the life we had built, to pretend nothing had changed. I followed him upstairs, slipping beneath the sheets beside him, feeling the warmth of his body so close to mine. But it was different now. I wasn't sure if he believed me. And worse, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to. Because as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.